Okay, so chapters 29 to 31. So, chapter 29, the main thing is that Bob Ewell planned to kill Scout and Jem for revenge on Atticus, but they're saved by Boo Radley. In chapter 30, Scout finally meets Boo Radley, and he becomes Arthur Radley in her mind. And in chapter 31, Scout grows up and she's able to finally empathize with Arthur Radley and walk around in his shoes. So we see a lot of progression for Scout here, mostly because Jem is unconscious. So she talks about recognizing Boo Radley for the first time. His lips parted into a timid smile, and our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. "Hey, Boo," I said. "That's Mr. Arthur, honey." So Atticus humanizes Boo there, and she herself humanizes him and sees it as a real person. And when she takes Boo onto the front porch, she states that it would feel more comfortable for him in the dark. She starts to recognize and understand things from his point of view. And this is definitely seen throughout the novel. She realizes that Arthur Radley is an innocent individual. She chooses to protect him. She's careful with her manners. She escorts him home. She sees him as an equal, and she's very empathetic in her final thoughts when she says, "As I made my way home, I felt very old. But when I looked at the tip of my nose, I could see fine misty beads, but looking made me dizzy, so I quit." And just like that, she's back, and you can still see she is a child. So she has this big moment of coming of age, but she does retain some of her childishness, and that makes it realistic. She also makes another comment that she thinks there isn't much left for them to learn. Again, that way you see that childishness still being there, but she is much more mature than she used to be. So a couple of symbols are just things that are like motifs. So just in general, motif, like the ham costume is the thing that saves Scout's life. There's a big slash in it from where Bob Ewell tried to get her with a knife. Boo is very interesting how she describes him. It is important to know that he's very childlike and that he is very innocent. He's been kept away out of society for years, and they describe him as such. There were white hands, sickly white hands that had never seen the sun, so white they stood out garishly against the dull cream wall. And his face was as white as his hands. His gray eyes were so colorless. And it really emphasizes that idea that why his name is Boo, the children see him as a ghost. And at the very end of chapter 31, Atticus gets Scout to read a book, and he talks about, and the book is The Gray Ghost. And when Scout is recapping it, she says, People misunderstood Stoner's boy, but he was real nice. He hadn't done any of those things. He was real nice." And Atticus concludes the book by saying one of the most important quotes, one of the most essential things in the novel: "Most people are Scout when you finally see them." Right? And that's represented in lots of different ways in terms of the different characters in the book. And here Scout has finally seen it with the first person who was introduced to her, who also ends the novel. And it's definitely important when we see this because they hold hands and he escorts Scout. She's not leading him like a child, right? She gives him that role as a proper adult, and it represents that friendship that does exist between them and had been growing the entire time. In terms of Jem, he's very courageous in his actions and leaderships. And Jem and Scout are still childish in some ways, but these events have shaped them. And it comes back to that idea in chapter 1 that this was like the very beginning of their world that I had read to you before. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right when he stood or walked, and the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by for us to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintained that the Ewell started it all, but Jem, who is 4 years my senior, said it started long. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill gave us the first idea of making Boo Radley come out. And that kind of highlights that beginning concept that comes back and ties in at the end of the novel. In terms of Atticus, we do see some interesting things occurring with him. Atticus says, "I thought he'd come after me." And he is courageous and he's fearless when it comes to himself. but his weakness is his children, and he is devastated because his children mean everything to him, and he's horrified that he somehow could have inadvertently caused this harm to come to them. It's interesting as well that he has this argument with Hecate. He doesn't want to be seen shielding Jem from the law, and he thinks that Jem has killed Bob Ewell. And he says, I don't want my boy growing up with a whisper about him. So Atticus wants the truth. But Hecate is not protecting Jem. He is protecting Boo Radley. And he says, there's a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it is dead. Let the dead bury the dead. He says, it's a sin, taking the one man who's done you in this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight. That's a sin. So he doesn't want people to realize that it's Boo Radley who saved the children, because then people would be coming and bothering him. They'd be dropping off cakes. They'd be trying to talk to him. And he doesn't want to force that upon Boo Radley, who wants privacy and isolation at this point in his life. And Atticus recognizes this. And so he says, thank you for my children, Arthur. He ultimately respects Scout's decision when Scout says, yeah, I do agree. And his most valuable possessions are his children. And Scout also has another really strong comment when she walks Boo Radley home. She says, Atticus was right. One time he said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. And that's part of why she recognizes that it is right for people to just assume that Bob Ewell fell on his knife and he killed himself. He's a despicable person. People would believe this, that he did go after children and ended up killing himself in the end. And so that's the position they take. So a little bit of loss of innocence here. When Scout realizes the magnanimity of the situation, she says, I could think of nothing but Bob Ewell saying he'd get Atticus. Mr. Ewell almost got him, and it was the last thing he did. We also see her coming of age because Atticus says, like, could you possibly understand this, Scout? And she's extremely mature, and here she says, well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? And that is exactly the second connection, right? So Boo Radley and Tom Robinson are both represented as the mockingbird in our novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, and the idea that it is a sin to do so. And so she doesn't want him to have to face that, and she recognizes that, and that's extremely mature. Other moments of coming from age, I took him by the hand, a hand surprisingly warm from its whiteness. And then she also says, I slipped my hand into the crook of his arm. Others would see Arthur Radley escorting me down the sidewalk as any gentleman would do. She realizes that perception matters, and she has the foresight to recognize how to make him feel at ease and how to get him to his house, but also to make him feel as an equal in doing so and not like a child. I made another category here in terms of just loss in general. She reflects upon this, and it is nostalgic is bittersweet because she recognizes that she can't give Boo back what he gave her. So she says, I never saw him again. She also says, Boo is our neighbor. He gave us 2 soap dolls, a broken watch and chain, a pair of good luck pennies, and our lives. But neighbors give in return. We never put back into the tree what we took out of it. We'd given him nothing, and it made me sad. And that's such a strong quote because it represents that loss, that she has this friend and she has this realization that he has done so much for her. But then she regrets her childishness in a sense because she wishes she could have done something for him. And that really shows that she's grown up here quite a bit. It's also important that they recap all of the novel in terms of the summer. So here it is almost the end of chapter 31, and it's an important recap here. So we go through all of the seasons, and it comes with their lives too. Right? So she looks behind and she sees all of this, all the neighborhood from Boo Radley's porch. It was summertime, and 2 children scampered down the sidewalk towards a man approaching in the distance. The man waved, and the children raced to each other. It was still summertime, and the children came closer. A boy trudged down the sidewalk, dragging a fishing pole behind him. A man stood waiting with his hands on his hips. Summertime, and his children played in the front yard with their friend, enacting a strange little drama of their own invention. It was fall, and his children fought on the sidewalk in front of Mrs. Dubos's. The boy helped his sister to her feet, and they made their way home. Fall and his children trotted to and fro round the corner, the day's woes and triumphs on their faces. They stopped at an oak tree, delighted, puzzled, and apprehensive. Winter and his children shivered at the front gate, silhouetted against a blazing house. Winter and a man walked into the street, dropped his glasses, and shot a dog. Summer and he watched his children's heart break. Autumn again, and Boo's children needed him. Right? So when they're talking about his children, they're talking about how Boo sees the children as his own, and he has been kind of their silent protector the entire time. Atticus was right. One time he said, "You never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough." The streetlights were fuzzy from the fine rain that was falling, and as I made my way home, I felt very old. But when I looked at the tip of my nose, I could see fine misty beads, but looking cross-eyed made me dizzy, so I quit. As I made my way home, I thought, what a thing to tell Jem tomorrow. He'd be so mad he missed it, he wouldn't speak to me for days. As I made my way home, I thought Jem and I would get grown, but there wasn't much else left for us to learn except possibly algebra. Right, so again, she's reflective here, very different from the beginning. Here, she recognizes all that she has gone through, but then she still maintains some of that childish nature. And again, she sees this when she's starting to recount the Stoner's boys from the Grey Ghost. They chased him and never could catch him because they didn't know what he looked like. And Atticus, when they finally saw them, why he hadn't done any of those things. Atticus, he was real nice. His hands were under my chin, pulling up the cover, tucking it around me. Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. He turned out the light and went into Jem's room. He would be there all night, and he would be there when Jem waked up in the morning. Right? So that is definitely why I do love this book. Because there are so many great messages, especially at the end, and so many great lines that really show all the events that shaped these two children and their world and their experiences, just like your world is being shaped right now. So that's the end of To Kill a Mockingbird.